Okay, so this is the third lecture. It's about tax incidence. So this is we're getting to the meat of it all. This again will draw on the theory you've learned in your micro class, but you're going to see a lot more applications of it. Okay, so we're going to start off talking about partial equilibrium tax incidence. We're going to talk about Gruber talks about 3 rules. We're going to talk about 2 rules in particular about tax incidence. And then we're going to actually think about partial equilibrium incidence analysis under imperfect competition. So specifically, we're going to look at the case of monopoly. That's why I wanted you to review your monopoly notes before lecture today. And then we're going to go ahead and move on to general equilibrium incidence analysis. And finally, we're going to talk about some empirical studies of tax incidence. In particular, we're going to talk about the Piketty-Saez paper. How did you guys like that paper? Good? Yeah, it was a little bit less technical than Gordon and Lee, right? Gordon and Lee was had a lot of notation to it, and this was different. This is actually, I think, one of the most accessible articles we'll assign. I'll assign all semester. Like, this is something you could send to your parents, regardless of how much they like economics. There's content here. I also want to mention and thank Kelly for sending out that helpful email. She actually went ahead and took a look at the income distribution. I'll make one slight correction. At some point, you used the word wealth. You meant income, because wealth is the stockpile of income, and income is the annual flow. But other than that, was a perfect email addressing sort of our questions. Yes, so income is very concentrated. The top quintile, the top 20%, earned roughly half of all income in the US in that year. So, okay, great, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to talk about 2 main rules of incidence. The first rule is that absent sort of barriers to price adjustment, the statutory incidence of a tax does not affect its economic incidence. What am I saying? I'm saying whether we ask the consumers or the producers to write the checks to the government does not affect who bears the burden of the tax, whose economic sort of welfare who is bearing the price change is not affected by statutory incidence. As long as, notice the caveats, as long as prices can freely adjust. As long as wages can freely adjust, as long as prices can freely adjust, it doesn't matter who writes the checks in terms of who bears the burden. The relative so in the second rule of tax incidence is that the relatively inelastic side of the market will bear the burden of the tax. This is back to sort of my little mnemonic. The elastic party gets to escape the tax, right? The relatively inelastic side is going to bear the burden of the tax. Okay, let's get in depth on these 2 rules. So rule 1 is that statutory incidence does not affect economic incidence as long as prices can freely adjust. So notice here, we're going to first look at initial equilibrium in this market. This is the market for gasoline. So we have a supply curve, S sub 1, which is our original supply curve. We have a demand curve, D. We're going to look at the incidence of a tax in this market, where we're going to go ahead and ask suppliers to write the check to the government. The statutory incidence is on the supply side. So we're going to model this tax, we're going to model the levying of this tax as a shift of the supply curve. How far are we going to shift the supply curve? We're going to shift the supply curve such that the vertical distance between the first supply curve and the new supply curve is the amount of the tax. Why is it shifting vertically? Because for every level of supply they previously were willing to supply, they now require 50 cents more to supply that level because we've levied a tax. So reflect that tax by lifting the supply curve by 50 cents. So we go from an initial equilibrium of A. We're going to shift the equilibrium. We're going to shift the equilibrium to D. That's where the original demand curve intersects the new supply curve. So we see a few things have changed, right? So we have a new equilibrium quantity. The equilibrium quantity has decreased from 100 to 90. And the equilibrium price has gone up from $1.50 to $1.80. The equilibrium price is the gross price, right? That's the amount of money the consumer is going to take out of his or her wallet and hand to the gas station owner in exchange for a gallon of gas. But then what has to happen at that point? The supplier has to go ahead and remit 50 cents for each gallon of gasoline he sells. He has to remit that 50 cents to the treasury, right, to the government. So while he's taking in a price of $1.80, the consumer is spending $1.80. What does the supplier then have to go do? Write that 50-cent check. So what is the supplier's net of tax price? It's going to be $1.30, right? That's what he's going to get. So how has the supplier's price changed? He used to get $1.50. Now he's getting $1.30. So how much of the tax is he bearing? 20 cents, right? That's okay. Happened to the day section too. It's sort of funny. And what has happened to the consumer? What did the consumer used to pay? 150. Now what is he or she paying? 180. So how much of the tax is he bearing? 30 cents. So the supplier is bearing 20 cents. The consumer is bearing 30 cents. Together that comprises this 50% tax, right? There's no incidence fairy. Every cent of that tax is either borne by producers or consumers, one side or the other. Okay, so this was a situation where it was the supplier that had to write the check to the government. Let's take a look at the same market, but in this case, we're going to ask every consumer to tally up, every time they buy a gallon of gasoline, or at the end of the year, they sum up how many gallons of gasoline they bought, and they remit a check equal to 50 cents times the number of gallons of gasoline that they've purchased. So this is statutory incidence on the consumer. So here we have one supply curve, and we're going to go ahead and shift the demand curve. Our initial equilibrium, like before, is at point A, with a quantity of 100 billion gallons of gasoline being consumed at an equilibrium price of $1.50. We're going to put the tax on the consumer side. What is that going to do to the demand curve? It's going to shift it down, such that the vertical distance between the original demand curve and the second demand curve is 50 cents. Why is it being shifted in that way? The way to think about it is that at every previous level of quantity demanded, the consumer is not willing to demand that amount unless they're paying 50 cents less, because now they have to pay 50 cents to the government for every unit they consume. So we're going to shift the demand curve downward. We're going to have a new equilibrium at point D, with a quantity, like before, of 90, but an equilibrium gross price of $1.30. So what's going to happen in this case, where the consumer is paying the tax, is remitting the tax to the government, the statutory incidence is on demand, the consumer is going to go to the gas station, pump their gallon of gasoline, right, take out of their wallet $1.30, hand that to the producer, and then go home and write a check for 50 cents to the government. What is the net of tax price the consumer is going to pay? $1.30 at the gas station plus 50 cents to the government is $1.80, just as before. What's happened to the supplier? How much is he getting from the consumer? $1.30. He doesn't write a check, right, because only the consumer writes the check. But it's the same net of tax price received and the same net of tax price paid, regardless of how we model this. If we model it as a shift in the demand curve or a shift in the supply curve. Because the statutory incidence, the side of the market remitting the tax to the government, doesn't matter. We achieve the same new equilibrium and the incidence is the same. Because what determines the incidence is not who's taking out their checkbook. It's how each of the parties react to changes in price. It depends on the relative elasticity of supply and demand. Just to make things clear, in these cases, right, in both this diagram and this diagram, we've shifted the supply and demand curve, right, just vertically, upward or downward. The new supply curve or demand curve has the same slope as the original one, because here we've modeled taxes that are called specific taxes. It's a certain number of dollars per item sold, right, so it's a shift. What do most sales taxes that we pay look like? Are they dollars per item? No, right, we pay percentages, right? We pay 6 or 8% in sales taxes. And so those taxes are called ad valorem taxes. And when we actually think about those kinds of taxes, it's not going to be a shift, a parallel shift of the curve. We're actually going to change its slope, right? Because it's a percentage change in the price. It's a bigger number of dollars of price change for higher prices, right? So it's going to change the slope. Even though this is the flavor of most taxes we pay in the US, we're going to generally in this course model taxes as specific taxes. We're going to talk about specific taxes. Not because it's sort of better in any way, it's just the math is simpler because there's just a fixed dollar amount for every price level. So while this is sort of what taxes actually look like, we're going to use the other type of model. And all of the logic we talk about when it comes to incidence, whether we're talking about how relative elasticity determines incidence, or that statutory burdens don't matter, or we're talking about how rigidities in the market might limit the ability to shift the tax onto the other side of the market, all of these principles will follow for ad valorem taxes. It's just the algebra is a little simpler for specific taxes. So if you have any questions about this, feel free to come to office hours or talk to me or Vincent about it. Okay, so rule 1 implies that it doesn't matter who is legally liable to remit the tax to the government. But there are a couple caveats. The first is that administrative and compliance costs often help us choose which side of the market should remit the tax. Like in the case of the gasoline tax, are there fewer gas stations or fewer gas consumers? your gas stations, right? So in terms of sort of the number of organizations or tax units that would have to fill out paperwork, it's easier to do it with the gas supplier, right, with the gas station. Second, any tax we actually levy has some cost to the government of administering it, of making sure compliance is what we want it to be, right, to make sure people are paying the tax. Again, that's going to be simpler with fewer tax units. So sometimes when we choose, which side of the market to tax, it's because of administrative or compliance costs that are direct. It could also be, it's going to be an administrative burden to whoever is in charge of remitting the tax, right? Sometimes the consumer is a more sympathetic sort of entity versus the supplier. Sometimes it's the other way around. So there's always sort of this additional burden to taxation, which is compliance costs. And we choose which side of the market sort of has the smaller costs on that side. The second caveat is that statutory incidence can and will matter in cases where there are binding rigidities in prices. What do I mean by that? Where somehow we prevent prices from moving, such that the market re-equilibrates. Right? Because what was the key in both of these situations is that the price in this case, when we levied the tax on suppliers, how is the supplier going to pass the tax on to the consumer? By increasing the gross price, right? The gross price that the consumer takes out of his wallet rises from $1.50 to $1.80. In this case, with demand, how does the market re-equilibrate? How do demanders pass it on? It's because there's a price decrease, right? The price goes from $1.50 to $1.30. That decrease in the gross price is how they are able to pass the tax on to the supply side. Because the consumer here is going to go home and write that check for 50 cents. The way they shift the burden is by changing the market price, right? The price, sometimes I call this, Gruber calls it the gross price. Sometimes I call this the transaction price, right? This is the amount of money actually changing hands. It's $1.30 here. So it's the ability of the side of the fact that the price can change freely to the new equilibrium price is what makes statutory incidence not matter here. It could be $1.30, it could be $1.80, depending on which side of the market is being taxed. If there are barriers to price adjustment, also known as rigidities, it could, in fact, be the case that statutory incidence matters. Let's look at one example. Let's look at the example of a minimum wage. So on the left, we have the labor market, right? It's in case A and case B. This is a labor market with no minimum wage. In panel A, we have a tax that's levied on the workers. In panel B, we have a tax that's levied on the firms. Recall that when we talk about a labor market, the suppliers of labor are individuals, and the demanders of labor are firms, right? So in the case on the left of when we tax workers, that's going to lead the supply curve to shift upward, because for each level of sort of hours worked, the suppliers of labor will demand higher wages if they then have to remit a tax to the government for every hour they work. So in this case, we're going to shift the supply curve up. We're going to model a $1 tax on each hour of labor. And so this new supply curve, S2, will achieve equilibrium at point B, where there's a decline in the number of hours of labor supplied and demanded in equilibrium, right? We go from H1 to H2. And the equilibrium wage rate rises from $7.25 to $7.75. That's the transactions wage, right? This is what the firm is going to pay to the worker. What is the worker going to go home and then do? Because the tax is on the worker. They're going to go home and write a check for $1 to the government for every hour they work. So their net of tax wage isn't $7.75, it's $6.75, right? So in this case, the worker's net of tax wage has fallen from $7.25 to $6.75. So they're bearing 50 cents of the tax. And the firms used to pay $7.25 for each hour of labor, and now they're paying $7.75. So they're bearing 50 cents of the tax. Without knowing the actual equations here, what can you tell me about the elasticities of supply and demand here? If they're each bearing 50 cents of $1 tax, these two elasticities they're equal, exactly, because they're splitting the burden equally. David?
I have a question in terms of all this. Over the summer,
Mm-hmm.
The federal government's ability to tax airfares expired and wasn't renewed.
Oh, okay, interesting.
But airfares stayed the same prices,
Mm-hmm.
even though the federal government wasn't collecting those taxes anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So the public continued to pay those taxes.
So the benefit of let's put it this way. So the tax previously had been borne entirely by?
It had come out of the pocket of the consumer.
Exactly. So what does that tell us about the elasticity of airline fare or airline service demand? It's apparently perfectly inelastic. But what's different here? Are we looking at the same market at the same point in time? There's also just time trends, right? The economy's coming back a little bit, so demand may have increased at the same time, right? That this tax expired. This is time series type stuff. It's hard to see exactly what's going on. But it looks like that, yes, if we were looking at the same market, the same demand curve, and we had this tax go away on airlines, where the airlines had the statutory burden, this would suggest that airline service demand is fairly inelastic.
But, I mean, there may be something just where if people are accustomed to paying a certain price, that
So this is the question, right? Suppose you've grown accustomed to paying a tax on my lectures, right? The thing is, if that tax expires and you continue to pay the exact same tuition to me, it's that somehow no one is able to compete with me, right? That sort of you're so inelastic at that price level, right? That there's something sort of structural about the market that I'm able to pass the tax on entirely to you. It has to do with the relative elasticities. That there's no good substitute for you. That another instructor teaching this course is just not the same. So you're willing to bear the burden. You're inelastic in your demand for this course.
Well, it makes sense that it's inelastic because if it's all of the companies, then you don't really have a lot of options.
Right, because what's the other option? Take the train or something, right? It depends. That's a good point. It's the scope of the tax, right? Because it's the ability to tax all airline fares. Yes, so excellent point. Tall? Yes, okay. David and Tall. Well, and I got Kelly. I mean, after this, we're probably done, but that's 3. Okay, here we go. So let's take a look at panel B, which is the tax on firms. So in this case, right, we're modeling this tax because the statutory burden here is on the firm. The firm's going to remit the check, i.e., demand is going to shift. We're going to shift the demand curve. We're going to shift it downward because in order to hire the same number of hours of labor, here the firms need to be paying less per hour of labor because they have to then write the check for the tax to the government. So we're going to shift the demand curve downward. Our equilibrium is going to shift from A all the way to C. The transactions price is going to fall to $6.75 because when they pay $6.75 to the worker, right, what does the firm then have to do in addition? Write a dollar check to the government. So their net of tax price for labor has gone up to $7.75, the same price. So they're again bearing 50 cents of the burden, while workers are bearing 50 cents of the burden themselves. So in this case, the fact that wages could move from $7.25, the transactions wage, right, the gross price could move from $7.25 all the way up to $7.75 in the case of a tax on labor supply, or move from $7.25 down to $6.75 in the case of a tax levied on suppliers. The fact that the price could move either way was what allowed the statutory incidence here not to matter, that the market re-equilibrate to the same new equilibrium regardless. Okay, now let's take a look at this labor market with a wage rigidity, with a minimum wage in place. And a minimum wage that's actually at the initial equilibrium wage level of $7.25. So this is a binding minimum wage, right? Wages can't be lower than the initial equilibrium. So let's first take a look at a case where we levy the tax on workers. When we levy the tax on workers, we know that the gross price of labor supply is going to go up, right? Because they got to get paid more in the market because they're going to go home and write a check to the government, right? So in this case, just like before, we have the new equilibrium at point B with labor supply or labor sort of hours worked of H sub 2, and we have the new transactions price for each hour of labor of $7.75. Remember, each worker goes home and then writes a check to the government for $1. So each worker's net of tax wage is $6.75, and the firm is now paying $7.75 per hour of labor. So here in panel A, it's the exact same market equilibrium as before. They split the tax evenly. This is when the gross price of labor has gone up in the market, right? The transactions price has gone up from $7.25 to $7.75. What's the minimum wage going to prevent? It's going to prevent a downward movement of the equilibrium gross wage. So in panel B, when we go ahead and tax the firm, right, we ask the firms to remit the tax. What would the firms like to do? They know that they have to write a check for $1 to the government for each hour of labor they employ. So they would like to reduce the gross price of labor, right, because they have to then send this check to the government. But the wage can't fall, right? The transactions wage can't fall below $7.25. So instead of having a transactions or gross price of 675, we have to remain at the 725 level. So instead of going to an equilibrium of C, like before, we go to C prime as the new equilibrium. So what is the new transactions price for an hour of labor? Same as the old one, 725. So the firm is now going to pay 725 to each worker. What does the firm then have to do? Write a check to the government, right? So what is their net after? What are they going to pay total? 825, right? So what's the incidence here? Who's paying the entire tax? The firm. But what's the other result of this rigidity? Sorry, say it again? Less hours worked. Because instead of having an equilibrium of H sub 2, what is our hours worked? H sub 3. There's an underemployment of labor, right, relative to the free price movement equilibrium. Because the price for an hour of work has gone up to 825, the firm is going to employ less labor. Because each unit of labor is productive, but is less productive than the previous unit due to diminishing returns, right? That's the downward slope of the demand curve. We're going to bid our way up the demand curve. So we're going to at a wage of 825, we see that the firm demands only H3 in terms of employment. Of course, at 825, workers would love to work a lot more, right? Because we can look at the supply curve and see how much further out it is. But we know that that's not the constraining force. There's only so much demand. There's only demand of H sub 3, and that's the amount of work that will be done. But when we talk about incidence in the second panel, who bears the whole tax, we said? The firm, right? And I know some of you will look at this graph and think, but there's less work, there's less employment, right? There's fewer hours worked. But the key to remember is that when we talk about incidence, we're talking only about prices. We're talking only about prices and incidence and equity in one breath, right? Equity is about incidence. When we look at this bigger quantity gap, right, the quantity gap is instead of being H1 minus H2, it's H1 minus H3. That's an efficiency story. And the reason we don't think of that as an equity story is that we think of every hour of labor supply, right? We have this labor schedule, this labor supply schedule. The worker is indifferent between working that hour at that prevailing wage rate, so at H2, right, where they get 675 and supply an hour of labor there, or stay at home and watch Law and Order. They're indifferent between those two things. Because in order to get them to work an additional hour, we have to pay them the wage according to the labor supply schedule. So it's sort of they're indifferent between this use of their resource, in this case their time, which is labor supply, or their next best use of their time, which is leisure, right? Similarly, when we think of a supply curve of a firm, right, where the firm is supply, we think of them as willing to make your widget and give you a widget for $6. But if you weren't willing to give them the $6, they're indifferent between doing that and the next best use of their resources, which is making some other kind of widget, right? So that's why the output gap is not a measure of equity or of incidence, but it is a measure of efficiency. So in this set of diagrams, right, in which market is the tax more efficient? On the left, right, because prices are allowed to move such that the output gap is smaller. In this case, by giving me the letters of the vertices, what is the deadweight loss of the tax in this case? It's a triangle, right? Which triangle is it? ABC. In this case, I'm going to help you with this one. The deadweight loss is going to be that triangle ABC, but there's an additional area to it. It's all of this output gap, right? So the deadweight loss in this situation is actually going to be this triangle, ABC prime, plus this triangle. So it's sort of the old deadweight loss, so imagine we had a line here, plus this parallelogram to the left, right? Do you see it? That would be the new deadweight loss. So when we think about deadweight loss, remember, it's the output gap is like sort of the base, and it's the area below the demand curve and above the price, and above the supply curve and below the price, because that's the loss of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So the deadweight loss is bigger when the wage rigidity prevents the market from re-equilibrating. Any questions about that? So yeah, the earlier you fix in your mind that price, incidence, equity on one side, quantity, efficiency, and output gap is the other side, right? Kelly?
Can you just repeat that
weight loss is bigger when rigidity.
So when the wage rigidity prevents the prices from adjusting, just as the market fully equilibrates, we have a larger deadweight loss because the output gap is bigger. We would reduce the output gap by having the price of labor fall, right? That's what happens on the left side, is the price of an hour of labor falls. And the incidence is split, right? The price change is split by consumers and producers, by firms and workers. And so the quantity of hours the change in the quantity of hours is not as big. Here you're forcing the firm to bear the whole tax. So their price of an hour of labor has gone up by more. They're going to demand even less of it. Cool. Okay, so let's think about relative elasticities. So this is an example of extremes, right? This is to sort of fix ideas. So in the first case, we have a perfectly inelastic demand curve. It's vertical. It has a slope of 0. In this case, in both of these cases, we're going to look at a tax levied on the supply side. Notice that the tax amount is the same. It's 50 cents in both the left and the right. So when demand is perfectly inelastic, what happens to the price? It goes up the full 50 cents. And who bears the tax? The demand side does, right? Because it's the relatively inelastic party. The gross price paid goes from $1.50 to $2. It goes up the full 50 cents. When we think of demand being very inelastic, what we're saying is that the consumer does not have a good substitute available to him or her for this product. An example of that would be like insulin, right? Or oxygen on the ocean floor. It doesn't matter what the price is, you're going to buy it. You're going to buy a quantity of it. On the right, we have the case of infinitely elastic demand. The slope of that curve is infinity, right? In this case, the same tax levied on the supply side leads the price to change how much? 0, right? It goes from $1.50 to $1.50. So consumers don't see a price change. But what does the supply side have to do at the end of the day? Write a check for 50 cents to the government, despite not getting even a cent more out of the consumer, right? The consumer isn't paying a cent more for this good, but the supplier still has to write a check for 50 cents for every unit. So they're eating the whole 50-cent tax. They're bearing the entire tax. Because here, supply is the relatively inelastic side of the market, right, in panel B, because demand is infinitely elastic, supply is relatively inelastic. Yes, Moniza? No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry? Arshi, yes.
When the demand is completely inelastic,
Mm-hmm.
consumers are just not buying that product.
Nope, they're buying it. They're buying a quantity of exactly 100. They don't change. So inelastic means that a change in price doesn't affect their quantity demanded. Yeah.
But then when the demand is completely elastic, then,
Mm-hmm.
then they're just, well, why, if I had substitutes available, then why would I buy that good?
So think of it this way. Imagine we had a good like Dole pineapple in a can, okay? And there was a Morton Williams and a William Morton's, right? There are two stores next door to each other. The can of pineapple at one store is perfectly substitutable for a can of pineapple at the other store. They're next door to each other. There's no transportation cost difference, it's exactly the same. Suppose they were both selling them at $3. You would be indifferent, right, to buying either one. Suppose one store increased their price to $3.50. Your quantity demanded of that good at that store would fall to 0. Because unless they charge that price $3, you're going to change your quantity to 0 because you have an infinitely substitutable good, a perfect substitute for that good. And that's what we're talking about. With infinitely elastic demand, we're saying you have an absolutely perfect substitute available to you. And so unless you get to pay $1.50, you're not going to buy any of it. Does that make sense? So this is, both of these cases are extreme examples, right? There are not many markets where we can think of demand or supply as being infinitely elastic or perfectly inelastic. Instead, we're usually in a world of some elasticity on both sides of the market, some slope to both lines, to both demand and supply. In the case on the left, we're talking about steel producers, right? So a steel producer has already sort of bought machinery, trained workers, has a factory. In the short run, he or she is not going to really change the supply of steel very much. There is some elasticity to it. For example, you could run the factory 24 hours a day if prices were very high, right? You might have a graveyard shift. So you can increase output a little bit if prices are really high. And if prices are really low, you could decrease output a little bit by not pushing your workers as hard, letting them be a little lackadaisical at work, right? So there is some ability of quantity to change in light of prevailing prices. So this line isn't perfectly vertical. There's some slope to it. But we would think of a steel manufacturer, at least in the short run, as having a pretty inelastic supply curve. So in this market, if we levy a tax, right, a tax, remember we model it as lifting the curve such that the vertical distance between 2 points is the amount of that tax. So here, when supply is really inelastic, a given change in price, i.e. a tax, is going to result in a much smaller change in quantity, right, because the slope is so steep. The rise over run is so high. And that's what we see here. And which side and where, and is here, the price changes from P1 to P2, right? Who's going to bear the burden in this kind of market when supply is very inelastic? Supply. And how do we see that? So if supply is writing the check, how do they make the consumer share the tax burden with them? They increase gross prices, right? Because then they're going to pay the tax out of that gross price. They shift it onto the consumer by increasing gross prices. But here, their supply curve is really inelastic. They can't move price all that much. They can get the consumer to pay a little bit of it, just P1 to P2, but they're going to eat most of that tax. Now let's look at a different kind of market. So here in New York, I think we have a very good idea of what a sidewalk vendor is, right? This is the guy on Prince Street selling those scripts, right? Those random movie scripts. I don't know where he gets them. I don't know who buys them, right? This is a market of mystery in many ways, but what we do know about this market is that if we suddenly levied a second-hand or found movie script tax, right? If we started taxing that good, that guy could easily convert his vendor setup into selling those metal earrings that some other folks sell, right? He could easily shift markets and avoid the tax. So we think of him as having a really elastic supply curve. If you start taxing him a lot, he's going to exit that market. He's going to decrease supply a lot. Okay, so this is a really elastic supply curve. So in order to lift that supply curve the same vertical distance, right? Because the vertical distance between these two curves and those two curves, as if we look at 2 points, i.e. this distance, is actually the same between these two graphs. It's going to, first of all, trigger a bigger change in quantity, right? Because slope is just rise over run. And because he's elastic, he's going to be able to shift more of that tax onto consumers. And how is he going to shift that tax onto consumers? By increasing the amount of money you have to take out of your wallet to buy one of those scripts. Right? We see a bigger difference between P1 and P2 here, because his elasticity allows him to shove the tax onto consumers. The elastic side of the market escapes the tax. Does that make sense? So if we levied a tax, let's say, on demanders, how do they make producers bear part of their tax? By lowering the price they hand the producer, right? Suppose you had to pay a tax for every banana you bought, and you had to write that check to the government. How would you make Morton Williams pay part of that tax? By lowering the amount of money you pay Morton Williams for each banana, because you have to go home and then write an additional amount you have to pay an additional amount in taxes. So it's by changing the equilibrium price that the parties shift the burden of the tax, right, from the statutory incidence to the true economic incidence. Okay, so this is sort of, that was all graphical. We could do this with math. This was in the appendix to chapter, you guys are chapter 19, right? So the appendix to chapter 19 covered this. And so let's say we have a unit, we're going to only talk about unit taxes, right, specific taxes. So we have a specific tax on a good. Let's say we put it on the consumer side. We know that the change in price, the change in the transactions price that we'll see, will be equal to, T is nothing but the tax amount, so that's like the 50 cents, right? Times the elasticity of demand divided by the difference between the supply elasticity and the demand elasticity. For a unit tax paid by producers, so the statutory incidence is on producers, the change in price will be equal to the tax amount times the supply elasticity divided by the difference between the demand and supply elasticity. So let's take an example. Let's look at a tax paid by consumers. Imagine that demand was perfectly inelastic. What's the elasticity of a perfectly inelastic demand curve? 0, right? And perfectly inelastic is not elastic, it's 0. So what would the change in price be in that case? 0, right? 0. Because the consumer is so inelastic in their demand, they're unable to shift the burden onto the producer by, how would they normally shift the burden onto the producer? By paying less at the store, right? And then going home and writing the check. But they're so inelastic in their demand for insulin that they have to pay the same price, right? And what are we going to see? We're going to see them bear the whole tax because they're perfectly inelastic. Let's think about a supply curve that is perfectly elastic. And we have a tax on suppliers. So let's look at this equation down here. So if supply is perfectly elastic, what is the elasticity? Infinity. Right? The eta, like the elasticity is infinity. So the numerators, forget the t for now, put that aside for a second. So this term turns into infinity divided by the elasticity of demand, which is like some number like -3, minus infinity. Does the 3 matter relative to infinity? It's irrelevant, right? So this term, eta s over the difference in the elasticities, is really just infinity over negative infinity, which is 1, right? So in this case, when supply is completely elastic, perfectly elastic, what's the change in price going to be? The full amount of the tax, right? When supply is perfectly elastic, it's going to bear the burden. The full tax is going to fall on supply. Okay. So this stuff is all very, we've drawn some very neat diagrams, right? But this is all straight lines, and we have these cute little formulas. But it seems very detached from the real world, right? Where we don't often actually have a demand function, right? We could somehow maybe get it through engineering estimates to get a supply function. Demand, we could do some surveys, but still for most markets, we don't have this kind of readily available set of curves. But the logic of tax incidence is broadly applicable because we're often discussing new taxes in markets, right? For example, let's go back to the 2008 presidential campaign. So if you remember, in the summer of 2008, we had this very steep run-up in oil prices. So by the middle of that summer, oil was trading at $140 per barrel. This also meant there were higher gas prices. And so we talked about this earlier when we talked about the composition of federal taxes. There are excise taxes on gasoline. It's a certain number of cents per gallon of gasoline, of federal taxes. So you could imagine there being a sympathetic case for, if gas prices are going up and part of that price is some chunk of money you're sending to the government, you could imagine there being sort of, at least on some level of discourse, a discussion of, if prices are really high, why doesn't the government stop taking its piece of that price, right, and bring prices down a little? That's a very nice story. But what do we know about taxes? So the one thing I want you to remember is markets don't take taxes lying down. Markets respond to taxes. They respond to taxes by changing the gross price, by changing the transactions prices, right? So if you rescind that tax, suppose that tax is 10 cents per gallon. Will the price of gasoline fall by 10 cents if you rescind that tax? Could. What would have to be true for the price of gasoline to fall by 10 cents if you rescind the tax? Demand would have to be perfectly inelastic. It would have to be true that demand was bearing the full tax and that the prices were literally 10 cents higher because demand was entirely inelastic and thus bearing the full brunt of the tax. And that's when we rescind the tax, prices will fall by that full amount. Okay, so we have all this logic straight in our heads. Let's go ahead and look back at that campaign. So this is actually out of an op-ed in the New York, not an op-ed, like an op-ed columnist in the New York Times, Paul Krugman. So he says, in a very on some level, right, in a discussion about, well, prices are high, why doesn't the government stop taking this tax right now, right? This is a sort of a somewhat reasonable argument to make unless you thought about the economics, right? So Paul Krugman wrote about John McCain's proposal to rescind the gas tax or have a gas tax holiday. He said, why doesn't cutting the gas tax this summer make sense? It's Econ 101 incidence theory. If the supply of a good is more or less unresponsive to the price, more or less unresponsive to the price as layman speak for inelastic, all that happens is that the pre-tax price, the transactions price, right, rises by the same amount. Is the supply of gasoline really fixed? For this coming summer, it is. Refineries normally run flat out in the summer, the season of peak driving. Any elasticity in the supply comes much earlier in the year, when refiners are deciding how much to put into inventories. The McCain gas tax proposal comes too late for that. The McCain gas tax plan is a giveaway, right, to refiners. Because they can't adjust supply, right? It's already baked in the cake. Supply here is inelastic. In the same way that the inelastic side of the market bears the tax, it benefits from any subsidy. And you can think of a rescinding of a tax as a new subsidy, or it's the canceling of a tax. You can think of it either way. So the inelastic side of the market is going to either absorb the tax or benefit from the subsidy. You get rid of the tax, it's the inelastic side of the market that will benefit, right? And in this case, it's not true in all markets. In the case of refined gasoline, it seems to be true that supply is sort of inelastic. I think there's a caveat here. I can't remember exactly how big the federal gasoline tax is, but if it's sufficiently large, you could imagine that we could increase gasoline imports, right? Because part of the reason why refineries have to run flat out in the summer is that we don't really build new refineries in this country. So as people, as the population has expanded, refineries have not really kept up. That's why they run flat out. You could imagine in a market where people could build refineries at will, there would be excess capacity to take advantage of any increase in price, right? But we don't have that. But you could, other countries have refineries, right? Including our neighbors, Mexico and Canada. So you could imagine that if the tax was big enough to justify the transport costs, we could increase supply by increasing imports, right? That's one thing. And my work on oil is showing that it's not about gasoline, but it's about oil production, is that here in the US, domestic producers are responsive to taxes. So when you levy taxes, they reduce production here in the US. So this is the refined gasoline market. It's a different market, but I would add the caveat of imports for this market. Okay, so that was sort of rules 1 and 2 about tax incidence. Or rule 1, that statutory incidence doesn't matter when prices can adjust freely. It can matter if prices can't adjust freely. And rule 2, the relatively inelastic side of the market will bear the tax and absorb the subsidy, right? It's the same. A subsidy is a negative tax. The same logic will hold. So if we start subsidizing something, it's going to be the inelastic side of the market that's going to absorb the subsidy. Okay, so I want to stop for just 1 second before we get on to taxes and monopoly. So something that's talked about here in the city, right, is soda taxes, right? This is bandied about somewhat. Suppose we, don't tax diet soda, and consumers find diet soda and juice and milk to be really good substitutes for soda. Who would likely bear that tax? If demanders are pretty elastic in their soda, if I said they're really good substitutes, what am I really saying? Demand is pretty elastic, right? So who's going to bear that tax? Sort of producers, right? That's about prices and incidence. Suppose I tell you that suppose we run some study and we guess that, I think 80% of that tax will be borne by suppliers, 20% by consumers. Or suppose there's another world in which 80% of that tax is borne by consumers and 20% is borne by suppliers. Suppose the quantity change is the same in those two worlds. So why do we want to actually levy these soda taxes? We think there's some sort of health externality, right? That there's some sort of cost to the health system that an individual is not internalizing when they decide to consume soda, right? So we're trying to internalize an externality. Remember, I said the output gap, whether most of the tax is borne by supply or demand, right, in these two worlds, the output gap is the same. For the purposes of the efficiency of this policy, does it matter which world we live in? Whether consumers are bearing most of the tax or producers are bearing most of the tax? No, right? Because I said the quantity gap is the same. What is the purpose of the policy? Why do we want to tax soda? If we think there's some externality, some negative externality. We think there's overproduction, overconsumption of soda, right? That's why we want to levy this tax. We want there to be an output gap. We think there's this negative externality. We want to reduce the production and consumption of soda. It doesn't matter to us if that's coming because Coca-Cola is making less money, a lot less money, so they're less interested in making soda, and the market re-equilibrates such that Coca-Cola is bearing the tax. It doesn't matter for that goal whether it's because consumers are eating the tax and thus the quantity has fallen. Those things don't matter to us. The way in which it matters to us, right, is that on some level we might have these feelings about, well, those guys who love soda, they should bear the tax, right? Those soda junkies, they should bear the tax. Or those soda companies that peddle this stuff, they should bear the tax. That story, right, the incident story is about equity. The efficiency of the policy, how well we reduce consumption because there is some negative externality, is the efficiency story. And the incidence doesn't affect that, as long as the output gap is the same. When I often talk about random asides like this, it's sort of from a pool of random things I think about when I write your exams, right? So these are all good things to sort of remember the logic of on the side. It's always related to what we talk about, but yeah. Okay, anyway. So you guys, I wanted you guys to review your notes on monopoly from your micro course, because we're going to actually talk about tax incidence under imperfect competition. The headline is that even though, I think sort of like the gas tax example with the McCain proposal, right? The gas holiday, there's something sort of in a gut kind of way when you think those monopolists, they're earning rents. Let's go tax that industry, right? Those guys earn rents. They have market power. Let's go tax that industry. But at the end of the day, the rules of tax incidence hold even in markets with imperfect competition. Today we're going to look at an example of monopoly, right? A monopoly is that there's one guy supplying the good. He simultaneously sets quantity and price. There are other models of imperfect competition, or other kinds of markets with imperfect competition, such as oligopoly, which means that there's a few players, there's more than one, but they still have pricing power. That's less well worked out by economists, so we're not going to go there. We're going to talk about monopoly. So what is the situation of a monopolist? A monopolist, so in a competitive market, what are suppliers? They are price takers, right? They just look up and say, hey, what is equilibrium price? It's 4. Terrific. I know my supply curve. I'm going to supply up until the point where my marginal cost is 4. Because what is marginal revenue in a competitive market? It's whatever the prevailing price for that good is, right? Your increment to revenue is just whatever you get to sell that good at. That is not true in the case of the monopolist, right? Because when a monopolist wants to sell one more unit of a good, he wants to go from selling Q1 to Q1 plus 1. In order to sell an additional unit, right, that next unit is valued less than the previous unit by demanders. So he has to reduce prices in order to sell one more unit. And that has two effects, right? It increases his revenue because he's getting some revenue from that next unit, but it also reduces his revenue because he loses some money on every previous unit, right? Because he has to lower prices. So there's the marginal revenue increment from the marginal unit, and there's the inframarginal reduction in revenue from all the other units he has to decrease prices on. Okay, and that's why he doesn't figure out quantity by looking at the demand curve. He looks at what is called the marginal revenue curve, right? It lies everywhere below the demand curve, because in order to sell an extra unit, he, yes, gets money for the extra unit, but loses a bunch of money on all the inframarginal units. So the marginal revenue curve is derived from the demand curve. We'll talk about how to do that in just a second. So how does the monopolist price over here? He's going to derive his marginal revenue curve. That's the dotted line. He's going to find the interest. What does everyone do, whether competitive or monopolist or whatever? They set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. In the case of a competitive market, marginal revenue is simply price, right? So marginal cost equals price. That's what we do in competitive markets. In the monopolist market, he's going to set his marginal revenue equal to his marginal cost, which is nothing but a supply curve, right? Supply curves are marginal cost curves. And he's going to find equilibrium, right? He's going to find the intersection between those 2 points. And he's going to find that he's going to sell the quantity Q sub 1, because that's where his marginal cost curve intersects his marginal revenue curve. But everyone, even monopolists, have to obey demand, right? Because if he tried to charge a price of P sub 2, would the quantity demanded be Q sub 1? No, the quantity demanded would be A double prime, right? Because at that price, there's a lot of demand. He can't make that much. Also, why would he choose to charge P sub 2? He's not a monopolist for nothing, right? He wants to extract all the price he can. So he's going to price according to the highest price the demand curve will tolerate, which for quantity Q sub 1 is P sub 1. So his quantity is set by finding his intersection between his marginal revenue curve and his marginal cost curve, i.e. his supply curve. He prices according to demand. He'll price at P sub 1. So that's what he does. Now let's look at panel B. This is a situation where we're going to have consumers remit the tax to the government. Forget the dotted lines. Let's just look at the solid lines first. When we have a consumer side tax, how do we model that? We shift the demand curve, right? How much do we shift it? The vertical distance of the tax, right? Okay. So now his marginal revenue curve is going to be a different curve as well. It won't be MR1, but it'll be the marginal revenue curve that follows from the new demand curve. And he's going to set a new quantity, right, which is the intersection of his marginal cost curve, his supply curve, and the new marginal revenue curve, which is MR2, right? So he's going to set a quantity Q sub 2, and he's going to price according to the new demand curve, so at P sub 2. So there's been a quantity reduction from Q1 to Q2, and the gross price, right, he's going to at P sub 2. Sorry, he's going to charge P sub 2. And the gross price has fallen from P1 to P2. Why has the gross price fallen? Because who has to write the check to the government? The consumer. The consumer is going to make the supplier share part of the tax burden by paying the supplier less at the store. Right? They have to go home and write the whole check to the government, so that they're going to pass on part of the burden by paying less at the store. The gross price is going to fall from P1 to P2 because the consumer is paying the tax here, is writing the check. Now let's do an algebraic example. So I'm going to show you that whether we look at this as a tax on the consumer or a tax on the monopolist, we're going to end up with the same equilibrium. The incidence will be exactly the same. So first, let's figure out the pre-tax situation. So we have a monopolist whose total cost is 12 plus Q squared. So the 12 you can think of as like the rent for his building or for his factory or whatever, and the Q squared is his marginal, is his variable cost curve, right? It's the part of his total cost that varies by Q. So his total cost is 12 plus Q squared. What is his marginal cost? It's the first derivative of total cost, which is 2Q. So if derivatives are not familiar to you, don't worry about it. I'm going to use that language when we talk about this here. But any problem I give you, I will give you what the marginal revenue curve is. So you don't, and the marginal cost curve is. So you don't have to actually take the derivatives. But just know the logic of it. The total cost is 12 plus Q squared. His marginal cost is going to be 2Q. The demand function is Q equals 24 minus P. So the inverse demand function, i.e. when we solve for P in terms of Q, is going to be P equals 24 minus Q, right? Okay, so that's so what is his revenue going to be? What's revenue is price times quantity, right? So his revenue is going to be 24 minus Q, parentheses, times Q, right? If we distribute, that'll be 24Q minus Q squared, right? That's his revenue. Everyone see that? Because we're going to multiply the price function, the demand function, by quantity. So 24 times Q minus Q times Q is 24Q minus Q squared. That'll be his revenue curve. We're going to take the first derivative of that, which will be 24 minus 2Q. Right, so that's his marginal revenue curve, it's 24 minus 2Q. And you want me to write that down and work it out? It's okay if that's... Yes, terrific. Okay, let's do it. I'm just going to grab slides so that when I put this away... Ooh, okay, there's no... Okay, we can figure this out. Does anyone have a pen I could borrow? Awesome. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, awesome. Okay, so we said that he has a total cost curve. So total cost equals 12 plus Q squared. Sorry, total cost. Marginal cost is going to be the first derivative, right? It's going to be total cost prime, which is going to be just 2Q. So far, so good. Oh, God, you can't see it all. That's not it. Maybe it's Iris? Is it getting better? Yeah. Sweet. There we go. Did it get a lot darker? I think, you know what, I think it has like a delay. So maybe let's try that and see if that, okay. That's pretty good, I think. It was like great for a second there, right? Okay, we'll stick with this. Okay, and I said that his demand curve, right, so Q sub D is going to be it was 24 minus P, right? Do we graph with Q on the y-axis? No, right? What do we graph in? P on the y-axis. So let's solve this for P. So P equals 24 minus Q. This is inverse demand. What is revenue? Price times quantity, right? So this is going to be price 24 minus Q times Q, right? Because this piece is just price. So what's revenue going to be? 24Q minus Q squared. We need marginal revenue, which is the first derivative of revenue, right? So marginal revenue equals R prime, which is just going to be 24 minus 2Q. So what is he going to do? Like everybody, he's going to set marginal cost equal to, oh yeah, absolutely, thank you. This should be, okay. He's going to set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. He's going to set 24 minus 2Q equal to 2Q. That's going to give us 4Q equals 24. Q is equal to 6. How is he going to figure out how much to charge? By pricing according to the demand curve, right? We know we're going to use this. So price equals 24 minus Q. So price is going to equal 24 minus 6. In other words, 18. Yep.
So marginal revenue is always the first derivative of total revenue? Okay.
Yeah. Cool. Yep. So he's going to charge a price of 18 and sell a quantity of 6. Sure, Tal.
How why is the quantity demanded 24 minus Q?
So that's the demand function.
Oh.
24 minus, the demand function is just quantity demand is 24 minus P.
Oh yeah, it's here, okay.
Yeah, so I give you the inverse demand, I think. I give you P as a function of Q. Okay, perfect. Okay, good. Okay, so that's what he's going to do in the no tax equilibrium, right? This is pre-tax. Let's go ahead and look at what happens if there's a tax on the monopolist. It's a tax of $4 per unit. So we're talking about this as a tax on the monopolist, right? So for each unit, he has to pay $4 to the government. So his marginal cost has gone from 2Q to 2Q plus 4, right? That's what the tax really does. It increases his marginal cost. You can think of this as an increase in his total cost, right? His total cost used to be 12 plus Q squared. It's $4 per unit on every unit Q, right? So his increase in total cost is 4 times Q. His increase in his marginal cost is just 4. Straightforward so far? Okay. Now we need to figure out how it's going to affect his supply and price decision, right? How does he decide how much to make? Like always, he sets marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. Has demand changed? No, we're levying the tax on the monopolist. It's the same old demand curve. So our demand curve is still going to be 24 minus, our demand curve is still going to be 24 minus Q, right? In other words, our marginal revenue curve will be the same, 24 minus 2Q, right? Just the same as before. Demand curve is the same, the marginal revenue curve is the same. Well, only thing that has changed is the marginal cost curve, because he has to now pay $4 per item in taxes. So his new marginal cost curve is 2Q plus 4. So he's going to set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. We're going to end up with 20 equals 4Q. In other words, Q equals 5. So the quantity has fallen from 6 to 5. How is he going to price? According to the demand curve, right? The price, the inverse demand curve is P equals 24 minus Q. He's now supplying 5, so he can charge a price of 19. So he's going to charge a price of 19 and sell 5 units. What has happened to the gross price? What was the gross price before? 18. The gross price has gone up to, so how much more is the consumer paying? $1. The monopolist gets his 19 bucks from the consumer, but then he has to remit 4 of those 19 bucks to the government. So what is his after-tax price? 15, right? 19 plus 4 is 15. What was his old price again? 18, right? So his price received per unit has gone from 18 to 15. Okay, so his gross price, what he's getting out of the consumer is 19 bucks. He takes his 19 bucks, goes home. What does he have to do is take 4 of those bucks and send them to the government. So how much is he getting to keep for himself? 15. How much did he used to get to keep for himself? 18. So how much of the tax is he bearing? $3. How much is the consumer bearing? $1. Because the way it works is we're taxing the producer, right, the monopolist. How does he shift the tax onto consumers? By making them pay more, right? That's how he gets to shift some of that $4 onto them. But he's not able to shift very much, right? He's only able to shift $1 onto the consumer. Because who is relatively inelastic in this market? The monopolist. So he's going to bear more of the tax. That's the story here. The fact that he's a monopolist does not matter. The incidence is going to be, the statutory incidence will not matter, even in the case of imperfect competition. Okay, let's go ahead and do the same problem on the other side. Okay, so the other thing I'll ask you is I could ask you what his profits are, right? So that's simply total revenue minus total cost. I could also ask you how much tax revenue is raised. How many items are sold? 5, right, after tax. How much in revenue does the government get per item? $4. So how much tax revenue is collected? $20. Okay. Let's go ahead and do the same problem, but we're going to levy the tax on consumers. When we levy the tax on consumers, we're going to think of this as a shift in the demand curve, right? What do we say happens to the demand curve? It goes down, right? We shift it down. So that's our way of saying that the new price, right? The new price the consumer pays for each unit, because who's going to go home and write the check now if we tax the consumer? Consumers. So for every unit they buy, they pay some transactions price, right, the market equilibrium price, to the producer, and then they have to go home and do what? Write the check for $4. So their new price is whatever price comes out of the market, P, plus $4 additional dollars. So we change the demand curve to P plus 4 equals 24 minus Q. That's a shift down of the demand curve, right? Because how do we graph demand? Do we graph Q on the Y? No, we graph P on the Y, right? So we need to solve this sucker for P in terms of Q. We're going to solve this for P in terms of Q. The new inverse demand curve is 20 minus Q. What was the old inverse demand curve? 24 minus Q, right? So where does this demand curve lie relative to the old one? 4 units lower, right? Because it's a shift down by the amount of the tax. Exactly what we thought. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's do the whole thing. So has the marginal cost curve changed? No, we're just taxing the consumer side. But we have a new marginal revenue curve, right? Because the demand curve is now a different curve. So our original demand curve, our demand curve is now, our inverse demand curve is 20 minus Q. Our new marginal revenue curve, right, is going to be 20 minus 2Q. Does everyone see why that is? Because if our price is 20 minus Q, our revenue is going to be 20Q minus Q squared. The first derivative of 20Q minus Q squared is 20 minus 2Q. Right? It's the same logic as before with this new demand curve, with this new inverse demand curve. Okay, so our new marginal revenue curve is 20 minus 2Q. Our marginal cost curve is the same as the pre-tax problem. So we're going to take 20 minus 2Q, set it equal to 2Q, because everybody sets marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. And we're going to find a Q of 5. The monopolist, like always, is going to set price according to the demand curve. So he's going to plug 5 into the new demand curve, but the new demand curve is 20 minus Q. 20 minus 5 is 15. 15. That's what the consumer is going to pay the monopolist. Who then is going to go home and write a check to the government? Consumer. So they hand $15 to the monopolist. They go home and write a check for $4 per unit to the government. How much are they paying in total for each unit they purchase? 19, just as before, right? And what is the producer getting per unit he sells here? What's the monopolist getting? 15, just as in the other tax equilibrium. So the incidence is the same, regardless of which side of the market writes the check. In the case of monopoly, just as it was in the case of perfect competition. So while sort of in this gut kind of feeling way, right, we're like, let's go tax those monopolists. Let's make those monopolists write those checks because they have all those rents and they'll write the checks out of the rents. This is not the story, right? The economic incidence is not affected by the statutory incidence, just like in competitive markets. Okay. It's not Eric with a K. It's Matt.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can we go back to the last
Yeah,
one?
sure.
Can you explain real quick
Yeah.
again how you go from, or how you get the marginal revenue equal to 20 minus 2Q? You said it's the derivative of something.
So there's P, right? P is the inverse demand curve. It's 20 minus Q. What is revenue? It's price times quantity. Let's imagine multiplying that P function by Q. So we're going to get 20Q minus Q squared. That would be revenue, right? We're going to take the derivative of that. So the 20Q, the first derivative of 20Q is 20. the first derivative of q squared is 2q. So we end up with 20 minus 2q. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
So marginal revenue is the derivative of.
Revenue. Yeah, exactly. No problem. I'm glad you asked. Anyone want me to write that down? It's the same it's the same thing as what we did before with marginal revenue, except with this inverse demand curve rather than the other one. Before we had 24 minus p, or 24 minus q, we now have 20 minus q. It's the same sort of math. Okay, awesome. Okay, so far what have we been talking about? We have been talking about partial equilibrium analysis. In partial equilibrium, we're sort of looking at only one market at one point in time. It's the short-run impact of a tax in a single market in isolation of all other markets. General equilibrium tax analysis takes into account the long-run effects of the tax on that market and on related markets. And we're going to find that if we ignore the general equilibrium effects of a tax, we're going to get the impact wrong. Partial equilibrium analysis is useful, but it's not going to give us the whole story. We have to think about general equilibrium. I often think of the general equilibrium analysis as sort of like a rabbit hole, like in Alice in Wonderland, right? First, we look at the product market, right? We levy some tax on some product, and we say part of that tax is borne by consumers, part is borne by demanders, right? Suppose consumers are part of that tax, they consume less of that good. That's going to have some impact on other markets that consumers consume in, right? If we look at the side, if the producer is going to bear some of that tax, right, and that's going to affect the factors of production that he or she employs, right, and the fact that it affects those factors will then affect other markets in which those factors are used. And we can go deeper and deeper and deeper into this rabbit hole. But don't worry, there's eventually an end, right, and we'll talk about this stuff today. Okay, so when we think about a commodity market, right, that's what we've been talking about so far, right, these widgets, this gasoline, these bananas, whatever it is, when we think about the spillover effects of a tax on a commodity, the spillover effects of a commodity tax onto other product markets, right? There's three sources of spillovers. So if we start taxing bananas, people are sort of poor, right? They can buy fewer bananas now. The price of bananas has effectively gone up. That's going to have an income effect. They're going to consume less of everything, right? They're poor, there's an income effect. They're going to consume less of all goods. So the demand for all goods will fall. If you think of pears as sort of a substitute for bananas, when there's a tax on bananas, you're going to substitute away from bananas and into substitute goods, such as pears. So demand for pears is going to go up, right? So that's a spillover effect into other markets. There could also be, if you think about it, so if we think about, suppose one only ate peanut butter on their bananas. There was no other real use for peanut butter, right? The main use of peanut butter was just bananas. No PB&Js, nothing. It's simply used with bananas in conjunction. When we reduce demand for bananas, we're going to reduce demand for peanut butter. So we'll have effects in substitute markets, we'll have effects in complement markets. We're going to have effects on all markets through income effects, and then we'll also affect other markets based on whether they're substitutes or complements. So in the case of peanut butter, if peanut butter is only used in conjunction with bananas, if we tax bananas, what's going to happen to demand for peanut butter? It's going to go down. Exactly. Okay. So that's sort of, in a sense, on the consumer side of the market, right? When we tax a commodity, that's the spillover effects that come through the consumer. But we know in any case where there's sort of shared burden, right? When we tax a commodity, it's going to have impacts on the producer side as well. So when we think about a commodity tax and how it affects the factors of production, for every good on the producer side, right, the producer is combining inputs to make that thing, right? Labor and capital. He combines labor and capital to produce bananas, to produce widgets, to produce gasoline, to produce steel. Within sort of when we say that the producer bears a tax, this sort of goes back toward the idea that corporations can't bear taxes, right? Citigroup can't bear a tax. GE can't bear a tax. When we tax something that GE makes, one of three parties, or these three parties somehow in total bear the tax, right? The workers, the capital owners of the firm, or the consumers of that firm, right? So we've talked about the consumer side, right? If we tax bananas, consumers will bear part of it. Banana producers will bear part of it. But banana producers are like, Dole bananas is not really something that can bear a tax. the tax will be borne by workers and capital owners of Dole. And the degree to which whether the capital owners or the workers bear the tax is again determined by their relative elasticities. So if you've already planted all the banana trees and you've already bought the banana harvesting equipment, your capital supply in banana production is pretty inelastic, right? But your banana picker folks could pick bananas, or they could maybe go work in another agricultural business, right? So who's relatively more elastic in that story? The workers. So who'd bear a tax on bananas? Who within the production side would bear the tax there? The capital owners, right? Exactly. But that's going to change, right? When it comes time, eventually sort of land gets tired. You have to buy other land to plant bananas, right? Your equipment wears out. Eventually, capital becomes more elastic, right? Because you can either decide to rebuy, buy new banana equipment, or buy new banana land, or you could just not. So eventually, even the capital becomes elastic. But in the long run, we'd think the workers are even more elastic, right? Because maybe you had kids, and you didn't want to move while they were in school or something, but then in the longer run, you're willing to move, right? You're more willing to move. So wait, so I've said capital becomes more elastic in the long run, and I've said labor becomes more elastic in the long run. So who's going to bear the tax? If everyone's escaping the tax, who's left to hold the tax? Who's going to bear the tax? People can substitute into banana like, synthetic bananas. What's the last thing there? The land. The land is going to bear the tax because land that could have been used for banana farming now isn't. So when people are bidding on that land, some of the demand for that land is now gone, right? There's less demand for that land because no one wants to grow bananas on it. Maybe people want to grow coconuts on it, but no one wants to grow bananas, so the number of people competing to buy that land is fewer. Demand for that land has fallen. At the end of the day, if everything becomes more elastic, the only thing left to bear the tax is land. Because you can't pick up your land and leave, right? The land's going to stay there. The landowner's going to bear the tax. Okay. When we think about these elasticities, when we think about how factor markets bear taxes, right? That within the side that the producer side bears, how much how much the workers or the capital owners will bear, or the land will bear. Also, it depends on the scope of the tax. So Gruber has an example of a tax on restaurants in his hometown of Lexington, right? So let's think about that. Let's go back to the initial market of restaurant meals. Once you have a restaurant, you're pretty inelastic in your supply of restaurant meals, right? But who's pretty elastic? Consumers of restaurant meals, if only restaurant meals in Lexington are taxed, right? They'll go drive over to Wellesley and eat there instead. They might cook at home. So the demanders in that market are more elastic than the suppliers. So who'll bear that tax? Suppliers, the producers. So restaurants have capital, right? They have like fryers and chairs and stuff. And they have workers. They have waitresses and cooks, right? And chefs. In the short run, the restaurant workers can go work in Wellesley, right? They could go work in another industry in Lexington. The workers are far more elastic in the short run than the people who've already invested in the chairs and the fryers and stuff. So what's relatively inelastic in the short run? Capital. So who'll bear the tax in the short run, of the producer side of the tax? The capital owners. And in the long run, even that becomes elastic. And where will the tax fall? On the landowners of Lexington, right? Because the productivity of land in Lexington has fallen. Because one of the uses for land is less profitable now. Okay, so that's Lexington. Suppose instead it was a Massachusetts-wide tax on restaurant meals. Do consumers have as good substitutes now? I mean, some could drive to New Hampshire, but not everyone, right? So consumers are going to be less elastic. Can workers shift to other industries as easily? No, right? They can't just go work in restaurants in another town. And capital owners, similarly, the restaurant business is long-term in trouble, right? Because it's going to be it's a tax on all. Let's put it, so capital in the restaurant business is less profitable. So where will capital move? To other industries, right? People aren't going to invest in fryers and stuff. So what's going to happen to the supply of capital? Let's say the alternative use of capital is like retail. You're going to invest in retail businesses instead, so like clothing stores or something. What will happen to the supply of capital in that area, in that sector of the economy? Go up. What will happen to the return to capital in that sector of the economy? If there's more supply, the return goes down. So workers are going to want to leave the restaurant sector, right? Because all across Massachusetts, restaurants are less profitable. So what will happen to the relative supply of labor in, say, retail? Go up, because we're going to shift into retail. What's going to happen to wages in retail? So a tax that was initially targeted at the restaurant industry is being felt by who? People in retail, right? Whether you're a capital owner or a worker, it's going to be felt there. So if you remember the the Gordon and Lee paper from last week, there was this whole discussion about how developing countries tend to tax tradable goods, right? Imported and exported goods are sort of, because they can see it at the port, they're going to tax that stuff. And maybe in the popular press there, it might be felt like, oh yeah, we're going to tax the stuff that's imported and exported. But is that going to affect even the non-traded sector? Yes, right? Because as we tax the traded sector, the factors of production are going to leave that sector and flood into the non-traded sector, bidding down the return on labor and capital in those sectors. So while we may have aimed the tax at one part of the economy, it'll be felt in other parts of the economy because we change the relative supply of capital and labor in those sectors. As these factors become elastic and leave the tax sector, they'll flood into the other sectors and reduce the returns in those sectors. So the scope of the tax has a lot to do with what elasticities are relevant and where this tax is going to be felt. Okay. Okay, this is exactly what I just said. I should have switched the slide, sorry. But this is just summarizing exactly what I just said. Okay, so I do want to talk about a specific case, which you can hear a lot more about in Amy Schwartz teaches a class on state and local public finance and urban public finance. This is talked about a lot more there. So suppose a town decides to increase its property tax, right? Suppose if the tax applies to land itself, we're going to think that the owners of the land are going to bear that tax. In a partial equilibrium, simple idea, right? If the tax is also paid on structures, the incidence of that tax will depend on the relative elasticity of sort of home or retail space builders and demanders of structures, right? That's sort of the local, simple analysis. And we think sort of people who own property, do we think of them as tending to be more or less wealthy on average? More, higher income, right? So maybe so in this analysis, this would suggest an increase in the property tax is a fairly progressive tax, right? If it's borne by those who own land, right? Or by those who demand or supply structures. But it depends, right? Because what's another use of houses? People live in their houses, but what else do people do with their houses? They might own additional houses and rent them. So suppose in the market for rentals, the supply of rental units, imagine, is pretty elastic. Imagine a world, right, where you could either use an additional property to rent it, or you could leave it sort of vacant, right? If that's a very elastic decision, if that's very responsive to price, then rental unit owners, right, could shift the property tax increase onto renters. And then our feelings about the regressivity or progressivity of this tax would be very different, right? So the ease at which that property tax can pass on to renters is one scope, right? Is one question. The other question is, suppose we levy a tax on, the town of Methuen. Sorry, that's in Massachusetts as well. Someone name a town in New York or New Jersey. Any town. Seriously? Sorry? Newark. That's one. Yeah, good call. It sounds like New York. I can remember that easily. I lived in Massachusetts for a long time. The book is written by someone who lives in Massachusetts. I forget all other cities. But yes, Newark. Suppose Newark increases property taxes. Will people want to buy houses? Will people want to own land at Newark at the same rate? No, the demand for land will fall, right, if the tax is borne by landholders on some level. What might people do with that money instead? They might decide to invest in Trenton, right? They might decide to invest in another city, maybe in New York or in Trenton or in Philadelphia, other cities. So what's going to happen to sort of rates of return on property there? If there's more demand, prices are going to go up. The sort of return on investment is going to fall, right, if prices go up. So even if it's Newark that chooses to raise its property tax, it could well be borne by neighboring cities as well. depending on how the factors and how demanders shift. Okay. So there are a few different views on this. One is called the capital tax view. And the notion here is that, we talked about people wanting to buy land, right? If we tax property ownership in Newark, someone may choose not to buy land at all, but they might choose to invest in building a factory in Newark instead, right? Instead of buying rental properties, right? Instead of building an apartment building and renting that out, they may choose instead to build a factory and make something. What will happen to the amount of capital in the factory sector, in this production sector? It would go up, right? And the return to capital would go down. So even if we chose to target the Newark tax at property, it could well be borne by all capital, right? And the capital view conjectures that all capital bears any tax on capital equally, because money flows from different kinds of capital investments pretty easily, and that it's going to be evened out over the capital market, over all forms of capital will bear that tax. That's one view. It just sort of, whether or not, so we think the property tax is generally pretty progressive, right? But how progressive it is just depends on how effectively it's passed on. If it's passed on to other kinds of capital, right? If it's that the return to factory ownership goes down, all this stuff goes down, it's still a pretty progressive tax because we think all capital holders on average are wealthier than non-capital holders. But if it's actually being pushed into rents, then it's less progressive, right? So it just depends on what margin on which this tax is being shared. Okay, so that's the end of our sort of conceptual discussion of incidence. And we have 15 minutes left and not 25 minutes left. No, I kept you 20 extra minutes, so not 35 minutes, we have 15 minutes left. So I'm going to talk about the Piketty-Saez article. I really apologize for last week. I mean, I also thought class started at 6:25, so the whole thing was just confused. But okay, so I want to spend the rest of this time talking about Piketty and Saez. So I expect you guys to have read the whole article, right? By today, hopefully, or if it's been a busy week, you'll do it tonight or tomorrow. I understand things happen. But I want to highlight some of the interesting things from my perspective. And while what I talk about here is sort of what I really thought was worth talking about, I sort of want you to have read the whole article. Okay, so the Piketty and Saez article sort of concludes that there have been striking changes in the US federal tax system and distribution of taxes in the last 40 years. The three most striking changes are the dramatic decline in statutory rates at the top of the income distribution. The second fact is that corporate income taxes as a fraction of GDP have fallen a lot. Corporate income taxes don't raise a lot of revenue. And that changes the progressivity because they assume that corporate taxes fall entirely on capital holders, right? And the last thing is that there's been this substantial increase in payroll taxes over this period. So I just want to give you some additional facts of what bracket structures used to look like under other previously. So IRTA, the Economic Recovery and Tax Act of 81, changed brackets, right? What do we really see? This is pre-IRTA 81, this is post-IRTA 81. What do we see has really changed? We basically cut out these really high marginal tax rate brackets, right? And we just sort of solidified it into a 50% bracket. So, I mean, not that long ago, right? 1980 was not eons ago. We had a marginal tax rate, a top statutory marginal tax rate of 70%. But what did Piketty and Saez say about these really high marginal tax rates that were up here, the statutory rates? That we weren't raising, it wasn't really adding that much progressivity, right? And why was that? It's because there were so many exclusions and deductions back then. There were sort of limitless deductions in a lot of ways. So even if you had a marginal statutory tax rate of 70%, even if you were wealthy, it was being applied to a small fraction of your income. So it wasn't raising average tax burdens at the top very much. So even though these rates were really high in terms of marginal tax rates, they weren't giving us a lot of progressivity at the top. This is before and after the Tax Reform Act of 1986. What happened? Well, first of all, we ended up with 4 tax brackets, right? Things got a lot simpler. And marginal tax rates fell from 50%, the highest marginal tax rate fell from 50%, all the way down to 28%. So what's interesting here is sort of one of the tensions of tax reform, we'll talk more about this when we talk about tax reform after the midterm, is that this tax bracket structure looks a lot less intimidating, right? It's not as much math. So that's the advantage of having fewer brackets, is tax simplicity. But one of the advantages of having more brackets is we can tailor our progressivity, right? Suppose, now, this is before and after the 01-03 tax cuts, EGTRA and JEGTRA. We have 6 tax brackets, right? There's some discussion sometimes of adding a 7th tax bracket, right? A millionaire's tax. that would add a bracket. It would make taxes more complex. In addition to having higher tax rates that create deadweight loss, just from an administrative point of view, it would be more administrative work, right, to do the math one more time, right, one more bracket. But it allows us to add more progressivity, right, to target progressivity in a different way. It allows us to tax people who make $350,000 differently than someone who makes $1.5 million, right? That's what that additional bracket would do. So we're trading off sort of tailoring progressivity against tax complication, right, of having more brackets. That's sort of one of the things we're doing when we reduce or increase the number of brackets. Okay, so Piketty and Saez sort of have this very ambitious idea of assessing the overall progressivity of the U.S. federal income tax, or for U.S. federal tax system over a 40-year period. It is not a small undertaking, and it requires real assumptions, right? Because there are things we just don't know. Like, I would be the first person to tell you that we don't know what the incidence of the corporate income tax is. We don't know whether it's borne by consumers of products, the workers of corporations, or the capital owners and corporations. We don't really know. There have been a lot of, people try to get at it. No one has a good idea of how to actually study this, and so it's sort of an unknown. So for lots of reasons like this, things that we just don't know, they have to make sometimes strong assumptions. So what assumptions do they make? Well, they assume, some of these are less controversial. They assume that payroll taxes are fully borne by workers. That's a generally widely held view. And that's because in the labor market, we think of workers as being relatively inelastic. There are elastic workers out there. These could be, we'll talk about welfare reform eventually and about how we got some elasticity there. And sometimes secondary earners. So when a spouse is a primary earner, the second spouse is a secondary earner. That labor supply seems to be elastic. But the bulk of hours worked in this country are worked by primary labor force participants, right? People, whether it's the man or the woman of the house, who work 40 hours a week, 2,000 hours a year, every year from the age of 22 or 26 to 65, right? That's what most hours worked in this country are. That's who they're worked by. Those folks are not very elastic. They tend to work 40 hours a week all the time, right? They don't tend to really move it around very much. So we think of labor supply as actually being fairly inelastic, and that's who bears the payroll tax? Workers, labor supply. Okay, so that's uncontroversial. They also assume that corporate taxes fall on capital income in general, so all capital income bears the corporate income tax. Estate taxes are borne by the inheritor or the descendant. They only measure direct effects. They don't take the change in behavior or deadweight loss into account. No untaxed income is included, so employer-provided health benefits and stuff like that is not included. It only includes realized capital gains. So as you accrue capital gains, that's not examined. And they use capital gains distributions as a measure of the corporate earnings distribution. They sort of equate those two in order to calculate corporate earnings. Okay, those are the assumptions. Let's look at I want to look at a couple of different charts. So on the left, we have, down here, this is the income distribution. It's the percentiles of the income distribution, the horizontal axis. We start at the 20th percentile because the bottom quintile of the income distribution, those folks are getting a lot of transfer income and they pay very little in taxes. Their situation is really not well described by their tax burden, right? It's sort of the combination of those things are much more important to them. So we leave them out of the analysis. We start at the 20th percentile. We go all the way up, and we actually look at smaller and smaller slices as we get up there, right? We're looking at, in the bottom, we're looking at 20th percentile differences, and up here they get to be very, very small. At the very right, it's only 1/100th of a percent, right, or percentile that we're looking at. Okay, and then on the right we have the same rate, sort of the rates of the income distribution in 1960. So when we look at these two things, what do we see? Well, there's a couple of interesting things, right? The estate tax used to do a lot more to rate progressivity at the top than it does now, right? What else is different? The corporate tax used to have a bigger effect before than it does now on progressivity, right? The top versus then versus now. But what's also really interesting to me is one thing we see is that the middle of the income distribution is taxed more now than it was in 1960, right? And what makes up a bulk of that difference is the increase in payroll taxes, right? Between today, or 2004 and 1960, social insurance programs had financing difficulties. We were paying a lot more out in benefits than we were taking in taxes. So we increased the tax rates for social insurance programs. Those are our social security taxes, our Medicare taxes. And a lot of those taxes, right, are borne by sort of the middle of the income distribution, because the social security tax is the biggest payroll tax, biggest component of the payroll tax. You only pay it on your first roughly $110,000 of income. and you only pay it on labor income. So that's really going to affect the middle of the distribution. Other stuff that's interesting, let's see, let me see if there's anything else I really want to talk about. Yeah, that's about all I want to talk about with this graph. Okay. So this is the reasons for the decline in progressivity since 1960s. This is sort of what, so I cheated a little. I changed this bottom part of the slide, but your slides don't have this wording. I did this after my assistant printed the handout, so this is the version that'll be up. And I'm going to actually change the first bullet point too, because it ignores a subtlety here. So the first bullet point says the changes in the individual income tax has had only a minor effect. That's not true. What that really should say is if we went back to the tax structure, the individual income tax structure of 1960, it wouldn't add a lot to the progressivity of our tax system. And that's because even though there were these really high marginal tax rates in 1960 at the top of the income distribution, there were so many exclusions and deductions that the average tax burden that those high rates inflicted was not very big. And so they didn't, even though there were high marginal rates, they didn't actually add a lot of progressivity because so much income was excluded from being taxed at that rate. That's what that should really say. I'm not saying that if we took the marginal tax rate from 35 to 39, that wouldn't add progressivity. That would obviously add progressivity to the code. What I'm saying is if we went back to the 1960 tax structure of high rates but a lot of exclusions, that would not add progressivity. And that's interesting, right? Because I think when a lot of people look at those high marginal tax rates, when they look at the 1980 70% tax rate or the 1960 91% marginal tax rate at the very top of the income distribution, people think, well, that must have been a source of real progressivity. Turns out, when you actually do the math, it wasn't. It wasn't. Those high marginal tax rates had a lot of disincentive effects, right? Because if you're only getting 9 cents on every dollar you earn, it sort of reduces, your incentive to work hard, right, on that margin. But it didn't actually increase progressivity very much. The decrease in the importance of the corporate income tax is one of the reasons why the tax code is less progressive. What's interesting, we'll look at it in the next slide. So this is the share of income received from different sources of income by the top 1/10 of 1%. Forget the 99%, right? This is the top 10% of the 1%. Okay. As we go through time, one of the striking things about this is that the share of income, the very top 10th of a percent of the income distribution is getting from wages, is really going up over time, right? Over here, that bottom sort of the sprinkled looking piece of this, right, is much bigger than it was in 1960. So people who are at the very top of the income distribution are getting more of their income from wages and salaries than ever before. A lot of that is sort of high power, high incentive pay contracts at the top, like stock options, stuff like that is part of that, is that explosion. But what this says is that suppose we took the corporate income tax and jacked it up. We said you're gonna forget the carve outs and all the holes in the corporate income tax base. We're gonna fill all that stuff in. We're jacking up the rates to 50%. This tells us that that won't add a lot of progressivity at the top, or it won't add as much today as it did in 1960, because in 1960 the very top of the income distribution got a lot more of their income from capital. So increasing tax rates on capital added more progressivity bang for each tax percentage buck, right? For each tax percentage we increased the corporate income tax, we added more progressivity in 1960 than we would today, because people at the very top are not getting as much of their income from capital income anymore, right? So the ability to increase progressivity by increasing corporate tax rates is less now than it was back then. Okay, and this makes the same point in two different ways. And the other thing that's changed is that the estate tax is adding a lot less progressivity than it used to. And this is sort of because we've increased we'll talk about the estate tax in a couple of weeks, but so everybody gets a certain exemption. I think now it's $5 million, I think. Well, I'll review the facts before I actually lecture on it, but it's roughly $5 million. It used to be much lower back in 1960. Lots of moderately sized estates were paying taxes, and today very few estates pay taxes in the estate tax. So that's the story there. Any questions about the Piketty and Saez reading? Any questions about the income distribution? It's interesting stuff. I mean, I sort of wish we could come up with a very short version of this and have it more widely understood, right? Because the lack of progressivity in the tax code is part of it. What really generates income inequality in America is not the tax system, it's the economy. It's not as easy a thing to make different. whether or not this is a good, I want to say this, whether or not the 1960s level of progressivity is a good level of progressivity, or today's level of progressivity is a good level of progressivity, is it's a personal decision, right? That's about your values. That's between you and your God and your social welfare function, right? That's all that stuff. We can just analyze it, and that's what Piketty and Saez can tell us. That's how it's changed. How you feel about that is you, right? That's all about you.